Hey, everybody. Welcome to our very first session on mental health matters. This first time, we talked with Melissa Austin about anxiety in the pandemic. Now, that's a really broad topic, so we didn't have time to get too specific, but we do hope that in the midst of this, you'll find that you're not alone, that being anxious, especially right now in this strange time, is totally normal. We also hope that you'll find some concepts and practices that can help you as you try to cope with your anxiety. Our Mental Health Matters Zoom meetings have two parts. The first is an interview with a mental health professional, and that's the part that you're going to see today. The second part, though, is a question and answer session with participants, and we didn't record that so that folks can feel free to talk and to ask questions. If you'd like to join us for one of our future sessions, we'd love to have you. Keep an eye out in our newsletter for upcoming dates. Well, tonight, like we said before, we're talking with Melissa Austin. She's a professional counselor in Richmond. She's been practicing as a therapist for over 8 years and has worked in both community mental health and in private practice. But, full disclosure, she's been married to me for 20 years, so she's had plenty of practice. Melissa works with clients of all ages, but has spent much of her time helping adolescents and children with anxiety and depression. So now we're going to go to our meeting with Melissa.
I guess when you were saying that, I was thinking I'm a bit of a late bloomer, honestly, to being a therapist. Worked for an undisclosed amount of time, just because I can't remember right now. Just in community mental health in a lot of different capacities, a lot of different roles. And before that, I got half of a MDiv in pastoral care and counseling. So that kind of, I've just accumulated experiences along the way. But worked in community mental health for many years. Now I'm in private practice, which is a much different kind of thing. But anyway, yeah.
Great. So I think some other folks are jumping in, so we're glad that you all have joined us too. Welcome as we get going here. So we're talking about anxiety, and it's a broad term. I think I felt it, and I think I know what it is. But sometimes I feel like it's sneaky too. So can you tell us, like, what is anxiety?
Well, it's an excellent question, right? And honestly, whenever somebody comes into a session and tells me that they're dealing with anxiety, I always ask, like, how do you experience anxiety? And sometimes people look at me like, what do you mean? Anxiety is anxiety, right? But it's really not. Different people experience it in different ways. And the part nobody really likes to hear is, honestly, anxiety is not all bad, right? Anxiety is part of what keeps us alive, right? It tells us not to run in front of the car in the street or to touch the hot stove or, whatever. So anxiety, people tend to think of anxiety as that feeling of nervousness, right? Or an active worry. When really it's more a pattern of responses and thoughts and emotions. Now, don't get me wrong, it can definitely be an acute feeling, but it's kind of much bigger than that. And often people will say, I don't understand why I feel worried or why I feel anxious or why I feel tense. And it's because it's bigger than this, right? So people think there has to be like like there's a math, right? A plus B equals C kind of thing. And there's just not always, right? Sometimes I always say the chemicals in our brain decide to have a party, and, invite us and include us, whether we want to be there or not. Sometimes it really is in direct response to, a triggering event. I do want to say, anxiety that stems like from a traumatic event or experience is a little bit different. I mean, anxiety is anxiety, right? There's this overarching theme and response. It's very predictable in a lot of ways. But if you are a person like who's experienced either an acute or a chronic trauma, your anxiety is going to manifest a little bit differently. The way you approach it is a little bit different. So there's lots of caveats, but in a lot of it's sort of that pattern, right, of response and thoughts. I'm looking because I do have notes to try to keep me on track and not ramble, because I do have a tendency to get on the soapbox. I think the main thing is that everybody has anxiety, right? Everybody experiences anxiety. Everybody experiences an element of worry or whatever. But it's when we start getting into these patterns of behavior and response that sometimes it starts to interfere, right, with our daily life, with our relationships, with our ability to complete tasks, with our attention and focus. There's so many different ways that it manifests. I'm not sure if I answered the question or not, but
it is. Okay. So, we talk about this all the time together, since we do live together. But I don't know if we've ever talked about it as the pattern of responses. And that's interesting to me, and how these things seem to be linked, and you go through these cycles of anxiety. That's interesting.
Well, it's a dirty little cycle, right? I mean, there's these loops that get created. Obviously, the part of our brain responsible for an anxious response creates all kinds of other responses, right? So maybe it's increased heart rate, or, my face gets really hot, or, I feel like I'm going to be sick, right? I mean, there's lots of different things. And so then we start to respond to the response, and then we respond to it, and it just creates this loop kind of over and over again. And then it's also these automatic kind of built-in responses of things that, not that this is biologically correct, but I say is always it's like the core of our brain, right? These things that are built in down in there that we kind of build other things on. And those are these, we call thinking errors, like shoulds and oughts and this all or nothing thinking, right? That it's this way or this way, and there's nothing in between. And a lot of times we don't even necessarily agree with those automatic responses. Like if we sit down and talk about it, we're like, I don't really believe that, right? But the response is still there. And maybe someone taught us that, or maybe it's just something we picked up along the way, or maybe it was like a survival skill we had, but they're built in. They're automatic. Good news is we can change them and alter them, right? But we have to kind of have an awareness of them first. And sometimes it's really hard to pick up on that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so as we're thinking about anxiety too, what about at different ages, developmentally? Do children, do teens, do adults experience anxiety differently in general terms, or is it mostly the same?
Well, again, I mean, anxiety is very predictable, right? Although I say everyone experiences it differently, right? There's these common themes and patterns that we see. However, ages and stages, I'm going to look at different things, right? So a parent who comes into my office and says, my kid is throwing tantrums and they can't stand it if they don't get their way, or if things change at the last minute, or if they don't know exactly what we're doing, right? And they see it as oppositional, or being a brat, right? My little anxiety flags are going up, right? That might be anxiety, right? Because that's kind of how it tends to come out in kids. Now, some kids will get withdrawn or shaky or panicky or whatever, but it does manifest differently. For teenagers, right, we see a lot of kind of tends to go one way, a lot of procrastination, maybe withdrawal, right? This sense of I can't do something really well, maybe like a perfectionistic tendency. I can't be perfect at that, so I'm not going to do it at all. Procrastination is one that people are equate it with laziness, and I equate it with anxiety. But anyway, because we want to avoid, right? We'll talk about that later, that anxiety has a lot of avoidance. And then in adults, it's maybe any of the above, right? Although we see temper tantrums less in adults, some people, but as we as we get older, we tend to internalize that more, right? So whereas 7 or 8 year old might externalize that anxiety, right, and express it in some very vocal or physical kinds of ways. As adults, we tend to internalize that more, or learn to mask it, or kind of hide it a little bit. So yes and no is the answer there, right? Like, yes, it is sort of the same predictable kind of responses and things that exist, but also it shows up in some different ways based on developmental tasks and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. Well, so since we've entered pandemic, we keep on, or at least I keep on hearing more about we're in a mental health crisis, and that there's, people are coming out of the woodwork to find therapy, and all that. So what have you seen in your practice regarding anxiety during this time of pandemic?
A lot of things. I will say definitely in terms of anxiety, I think that this whole pandemic has created or heightened existing anxiety in everyone. And I can't help but look at that and go, well, yeah, of course, right? Like how is anxiety not a logical response to this threatening thing, right? That doesn't have a shape or a form. We can't walk down the street and go, oh, there's the thing to avoid, right? It's this, invisible threat. So yes, I mean, we've definitely, I think, maybe it's because I tend to focus on anxiety in my practice, but I definitely think anxiety is something that, like I said, has either been sort of created or heightened in pretty much everybody, even if there's not a specific fear about becoming ill or someone I love being ill. Everything just takes twice as long, twice as much energy, right? Twice as much thinking about, right, what I'm doing or where I'm going. Something that took me 5 steps before takes me 10 steps now, and we've adapted and done that. There is a lot of talk about a mental health crisis. Maybe it's an unpopular opinion. I think the mental health crisis existed before COVID. I think it just sort of created a spotlight, right? And the supports and the community and the connection that existed that helped a lot of people cope with some difficulties in their mental health or their anxiety just, haven't been there as much. So yes, crisis, but also not, right? It was kind of already there and needed our attention even before, but at least there is some attention to it now. I do want to say this about the pandemic. People who live with high levels of anxiety, like I'll put myself in there, we tend to be hyper vigilant, right? So it's this sense of like waiting for the bad thing to happen, right? Waiting for the other shoe to drop, whatever, cliche kind of metaphor you want to use for it. We're on edge, right? And that's what this pandemic, I feel like, has created in a lot of us, right? It's this sense of like we have a tripwire now that maybe we didn't have before, maybe we did, right? But for some people who maybe had a manageable level of anxiety, right, or just kind of a baseline level, there's this tripwire now of this anxiety, this threat that didn't exist before. And so it's a little bit of a domino effect, right? So that rug gets pulled out from underneath you. And you start to just expect it, right? And especially early on, I think a lot of us have adapted to it for better or for worse now, but, especially early on back, March, April, May, kind of 2020, it was this constant sense, oh, here's the next thing, here's the next thing, here's the next thing, or this is changing, this is evolving. Now what, and I think we do still have that now, although we might become a little callous to it. But anyway, but once you get that rug pulled out from underneath you, right? Anxiety alarm is triggered and says, oh, that happened. Now it's going to happen again. And we're waiting and we're kind of on edge. And so it creates this sense of just kind of chronic tension that a lot of people have lived with for a long time, but a lot of people didn't have, I think, before a pandemic, before this sense of this thing that's threatening kind of my life. So this idea of like, is it just going to keep happening, or waiting for the next bad thing or the next bad piece of news or whatever. So, Yeah, I think that's all I was going to say.
Yeah. It sounds like patterns again too. You're seeing patterns, noticing, and they're repeating over and again. Yeah, I felt like in the pandemic, that I was already an anxious person, but I got to a place where I had to find a therapist. Other than just you, I had and really needed that and help because it was kind of manageable before, but it just seemed like it pushed everything over the edge right now. So, yeah. Well, so now here's the part. This is why everybody came, and this is what I want to know. What are some things we can do with anxiety, and how do I get rid of it and never deal with it again?
If you figure that out, we can market it and go live on a private island somewhere, right? And just we can retire and be done because everybody wants that magic pill, right? So here's the thing. Our natural response to anxiety is avoidance. Okay. So, that short term, that's where procrastination, right? I'm saying procrastination is related to anxiety because it's that avoidance. Feels good in the short term, right? In the long run, makes everything much, much worse, right? So I always use the example that if I'm afraid of dogs, right? Which I'm not, but if I were, and I avoid dogs for years, right? And then one day I am walking through the park and a dog runs up to me, my response is going to be exponential, right? Compared to what it would be if I had been encountering dogs, right, for all the years before, right? So it's that balance between this short-term desire for relief, right? To feel better, to feel okay, and then the long-term bigger picture of what is going to help me kind of tolerate the discomfort that I feel. And no one who comes to my office likes that that's kind of my response with anxiety, right? But it's not something that we can just delete. Right. And so if we go into this idea of managing anxiety with the goal of getting rid of it, right, or feeling zero anxiety in order to do whatever, right? So like in my example, if I think, well, yeah, I want to, get to know a dog, right? But I got to get my anxiety down to zero first and have zero anxiety about meeting the dog. And then I'll go and do it. I'm probably never going to go meet that dog, right? Because that whole mentality is kind of flawed, right? Now, don't get me wrong. Like if I could wave a magic wand and take people's anxiety away, right? I'd do it. I do that for myself, right? But that's just not how it works. So we have to kind of shift that mindset a little bit to how do we work to manage and confront our anxiety. And that's really scary, right? People say, well, I don't want to confront it because then what if I fall down the hole and spiral and everything's terrible, right? But when we can confront it, when we actively engage in kind of expanding our comfort zone, right? Like my dog example, that in the long run is actually what helps to reduce the anxiety. Right. Now, for some more like ambiguous or non-specific anxiety, we can't necessarily confront it. Right. So like, I don't know, if someone has a lot of anxiety around death, right? It's not something you can actively confront and then be like, okay, I'm good. Let me, go back, So, but what we can do is we can look at thoughts, those patterns, those emotions, right? And we can actively kind of turn and engage with those instead of engaging in the avoidance. Anxiety wants certainty, right? Anxiety wants control. That's kind of what, that's what we look for. So speaking of pandemic, right? Like, boy, didn't that just take away all that, right? That sense of like certainty or like things feeling normal. I don't like that word, but use my air quotes, normal. So that certainty, that urge for control and certainty, when that gets taken away, right, that heightens that. Do also want to say anxiety is very physical, right? So talking about managing anxiety, we can't kind of overlook the benefits of paying attention to our body and to our physical responses. And there's a loop there too, right? So I'm sure everybody here could think of a time when they got really worried or nervous about something and they had a physical response, right? Got a headache, I got sick, I fainted, whatever. But the opposite can also be true, right? So I'm trying to think of a good example. If I feel like I can't breathe well, right? I'm really sensitive to smells, right? So sometimes I get in a situation and there's a scent and I feel like I can't get a good breath, and I'll see anxiety goes up, right? So sometimes our physical responses that sort of mimic some of those anxious responses can trigger that anxiety alarm in our brain too. So when we can do like proactive skills, like kind of like relaxation exercises, body scans, mindfulness activities, breathing. Now, again, none of these things, right, with the intention of getting rid of anxiety, but utilizing those things to help reduce our response and to increase an awareness of our response so that we can kind of hit the brakes, right? Rather than just rolling into the response and experience. So.
Yeah, that I got to be honest, that's not what I wanted to hear.
It's a disappointment, isn't it?
It really
it's a disappointment.
It's really a big disappointment. I was hoping that we would just be able to give the cure tonight, but alas. That is a big shift. Is as someone who's tends to avoid those things, and I got really good at it. The managing of that is really hard, and it can be scary. Okay, I didn't get good at it.
No. It's what I always tell people is there's only so much you can shove under a rug before you trip over it. There's just only so much. And that's physical too, right? Like there's only so much of my emotions or my thinking that I can stuff down before my body goes, hey, there's no more room here, right? And I get a migraine or I get sick or I cry or I, whatever. There's all kinds of ways that it overflows, right? There's only so much of that tension that we can kind of carry. I do want to say too, just as a caveat, and I do not claim to be an expert in, much of anything, but I will say there is sort of a special, we talked like trauma and how there's the anxiety response with trauma and how that's a little bit different. I will say people who have chronic pain or chronic illness also experience, I would say, a different kind of anxiety, because anxiety is anxiety, but a lot of people maybe who didn't deal with high levels of anxiety or difficulty managing that before, then when they're dealing with pain or illness or something like that, see this spike. And maybe it's an active, I'm worried about this, or I'm worried that this won't get better, or this will get worse. But a lot of times it is really linked to that physical experience too. And so that is something that, is kind of a different situation.
Yeah. Well, so if we talk about management, if somebody is, struggling with anxiety, what do you recommend? What are some things that they can do to help manage the anxiety and maybe find a healthier way to deal with it?
Well, for one thing, I'll pick on you, because it's you. Use the word struggle. Use the word struggle. I would say that all of us right now can benefit from some anxiety management, even if we don't actively see it as interfering with our lives. Because again, even if you're not actively like laying in bed and playing over worries in your head at night when you're trying to go to sleep, again, we all kind of just have this level of tension and discomfort, right? That has come along with what year of the pandemic are we in now? So, it's just, this exists, right? And so looking at that. So I think really, and I know I'm repeating myself, but like really is one, just sort of changing our perspective. Instead of saying like, I've got to get rid of this, I can't feel this, I don't want to experience this, which who does, right? Who wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, today, I think I really want to be anxious. Like that is my goal for today. You know, nobody does that, right? So nobody wants to feel that. But instead of, it's that mind shift, right? From elimination, right? To management. Say like, how can I manage it instead of it managing me, right? Because again, right, like we said before, some element of anxiety is helpful for, you know, the whole like staying alive part, right? And that's important. We need some element of that, but we want to just shift that mindset a little bit. And a lot of that is learning how to tolerate discomfort, right? So if there is something in particular that creates anxiety, like for a lot of people, with the pandemic, there has been an increased sense of social anxiety, right? So for however long, I was mostly in my house and saw one or two or three or whatever many people, and that was kind of it. My experience was really limited. I'm seeing a lot of people who have a lot of sensory sensitivity. That was hard to say, right? So like all of a sudden loud noises bother me and they didn't before, you know, that kind of thing. So if you're noticing those kinds of things, you can practice tolerating the discomfort. Sounds gross, right? I mean, that sounds awful, but like that's really what it's how do we actively kind of engage in tolerating that? And you can do it on your terms, right? I always say you don't have to go to Walmart on a Saturday afternoon, right? Because like, nobody wants to go, period. But like, like you can gradually, right, or bit by bit, engage in things that stretch that comfort zone, right, that has shrunk over time. So that active practice of tolerating discomfort or acknowledging uncertainty. So other things, I mean, of course, therapy, right? I'm going to plug therapy as a therapist. There's nothing magical about therapy. There's nothing, I mean, if you go to a therapist and they tell you that they have all the answers, you probably need to find another therapist. But what we can do, right, is it's this turning and facing, right? I'm turning and acknowledging, I'm turning and confronting. As cheesy as it sounds, I tell people this all the time, things lose their power when they're brought out into the light. Right. So the more we hold on to something and the further inward we turn it, it tends to just feel like it gains power. Right. And there's something about just, we talk about the confession, right? I mean, this act of confession, this act of speaking, this act of bringing something into the light, suddenly it doesn't have quite so much power over me anymore. Again, not magical, right? But just an element of it. So, therapy is great, right? You do have to find somebody that you fit with. There's lots of different ways to find a good therapist, and we can talk about that if we need to. But anyway, yeah, so therapy. Connection, right? Which seems like a super basic thing, especially with our congregation, because I think our congregation really emphasizes that and that sense of how important that is to be seen and heard and validated and connected to other people. But that is something that in some ways we have lost, at least aspects of it, right? Over the course of the pandemic. Connection with other people not only is just good for our health all around, right? Also offers us perspective, right? So again, the more inward the focus, right, the bigger that anxiety becomes. The more I can sort of turn out and connect, right? It helps to sometimes give us a perspective and to ground us a little bit in a way that again, doesn't get rid of it, right? But just helps us to feel a little bit grounded. Other things, exercise. I mean, everybody exercise. Exercise, of course, is good, right? For your mental health, physical health, whatever. But also just like this idea of physical processing. Again, talking about anxiety is very physical, right? I mean, where do you hold your anxiety in your body? If I ask you that, where do you hold it?
Me?
You didn't know I was going to ask you a question. Yeah. Everybody else is muted.
Oh yeah. In my shoulders.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
right here.
And I feel it here, but it's mostly in my shoulders and my neck.
Yeah. So most of us could probably say, you know, I was going to put you on the spot, did you? Most of us could probably identify like where we feel some of that tension or anxiety in our body. Like for me, it's shoulders too, right? But, you know, sometimes we find ourselves clenching our fists, right? Or grinding our teeth is one that a lot of people do, right? Whatever it is, when we can start to then recognize and then do something to sort of help counter that, right? So if I know I carry it in my shoulders and my neck, then how can I do some stretches or exercises or, you know, whatever that help process that, right? Help to kind of release that physical tension. I'm also a really big advocate of doing something every day that makes you tired afterward physically, right? And if people automatically go to like getting on the treadmill or what, you know, I'm like, turn the music on and dance wildly in your kitchen, right? For one song. Turn a timer on and see how many jumping jacks you can do in a minute, right? Like whatever, like because what's happening is that tension that builds up, right? We're looking for ways to release it. Does that magically get rid of anxiety? No, but it helps that physical processing, which might help reduce the triggering of that anxiety alarm, right? It's all connected. The last thing I was going to say is just mindfulness activities, which mindfulness is a real trendy kind of thing right now. If you were to Google mindfulness, you come up with all kinds of things. But my probably very not accurate nutshell version of mindfulness is just how do I actively practice doing one thing at a time, right? We live in a distracted culture, right? I can multitask. I know you don't believe in multitasking, Erin, but right, we do multitask, right? I mean, because we can say we're relaxing in front of the television, but what else are we really doing, right? How many of us, and maybe some of you do, but sit and just eat a meal and don't do anything else, right? No conversation. I'm bad about reading while I eat if I'm alone, right? Or watching something or, you know, whatever. So mindfulness is this practice of like, how can I give, right? Intentional attention to kind of one thing at a time. Again, doesn't magically erase anxiety, right? But it's just this practice of giving attention to recognizing what's happening, right? And being mindful. Because if I'm mindful of it, then I can actively change something and do something differently.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And maybe recognize those patterns, interrupt them. Yeah. That's
or recognize it as it's happening. Yeah. That's why a lot of people, you know, they go all day long. You're distracted. There's things, and then they lay down to go to sleep at night and they can't go to sleep, right? The hamster in the wheel is going in their brain, right? Running really hard, not getting anywhere, right? Just over and over again, because I haven't taken the time throughout the day to process or to consider or to turn and face, right? And so then it's all hitting me all at once when I am trying to go to sleep and do something different. So,
right. Well, thank you so much for sharing. That's great. That's wonderful. We're gonna take some time for some questions now. So I'm going to stop the recording.
Well, thanks again for joining us this evening. We hope that you found some things that will be helpful to you as we all continue to deal with anxiety in the midst of this ever-evolving pandemic. Again, we'd love to see you at our next session that will take place in March with Riley Kincaid. You can find out more about that and everything else that's going on if you go to our website, lexcentral.com. There you can sign up for our newsletter and stay in touch. We'll see you again soon. Bye.